Do you like dramatic zooms? He did what to a bunch of grapes? Do you like silly transitions? Do you like reactive audio? Well, if you do, I've got the plugin for you. What is up, everyone? My name is Cam Kawati and welcome to my channel. Today, I'm going to be showing you one of the most useful plugins for OBS. So stick around. It'll be a lot of fun. But first, logo. The plugin that we're looking at today is called Move Transition. It's a really useful plugin and it has 3 different main functions, and I'm going to be taking you through those in this video and show you some of the things that you can do with them. Before we look at what the plugin can do, first let's go and download it and go through the install process so you can see how to install it. The first thing you want to do is you want to navigate to this page here. I'll put the links in the description below. Click on the download button. Depending on what operating system you're running on, choose the version that works for you. I'm going to go with the Windows installer. I recommend, if you have Windows, going with the installer over the regular one. It just makes it easier. Click on the download button. Do the, blibbity boo. Now that we know it's been installed successfully, we can go through the functions one by one. First things first is we can go through the zoom function. To use this, go to whichever source you want to activate it on. Note that you can only use it on scenes. So for example, if you want to use it for a camera, you need to nest your camera within a scene. To go through that before we look at the function, I can show you here. This is my camera scene. It has my microphone as well as a couple of other things, but what you can do is you can put your camera in here and then this becomes a nested scene. The advantage of having a nested scene, like for example for your camera, is that if you have this in a number of different scenes, such as your just chatting screen, your game screen, you can update your nested scene and then all of the changes will cascade down through those other screens that you use it in. So to use the first function of the Move Transition plugin, you need to go to wherever your nested scene is and click on it. Then you can right click and you can go to the filters option, and then from here, right click again, click add, and then click move source. Once you've done that, you can give it whatever name you want. I'm going to call it dramatic zoom because we're going to make it dramatic zoom. It's kind of obvious, it's in the name. Once you've added the filter, you'll see a number of different options appear. The first tab here, the general tab, is going to give you a rough idea of how to set up everything. So for the first thing here, for the source, you're going to want to select whatever the source is that is going to be affected by the filter. We're going to select the main camera source, as this is the one that is taking the video right now. You have your start delay here, which is how long the filter will wait before activating. Then you have your custom duration here, which is how long between point A before the filter activates and point B when the filter ends. So that chooses how long the movement is going to be. And then you have your end delay, which is how long at the end of the movement that the filter waits before doing the next action. After that, you have 2 more options. You have the easing and the easing function. For the easing itself, you can imagine that the movement from point A to point B is linear. Whereas if you add in the easing in option here, you can imagine that the movement goes from point A, and as it approaches point B, it starts to slow down. And if you have the easing out option, it means as the movement is leaving point A, it slowly moves out and then it goes as normal to point B. Or else you can also do the ease in and out, which means it will slowly move away from point A, and as it approaches point B, it will slow down again. These can be very nice, they can be very aesthetically pleasing, but it's up to you whichever version you prefer. After that, this is going to be the most important part of the movement itself, is the transform section. In the transform window, there are a couple of different options. You can see that there's X, Y, rotation bounds. The X stands for the X axis. Obviously, it's going to be anything on the X axis. The Y stands for the Y axis, and you have rotation, etc. You can manually edit these yourself, or else you can do what I think is easier to do, which is where you select the source in the source box, and then you manually move it around however you want to. For example, for this one, we're going to manually zoom in the image, and then you just click on the Get Transform button and it will update itself. You can see that this window here has updated. I think that's a bit easier to do, but it's up to you. Once you've done that and you've gotten the numbers for the transform box, you can restore the source to however it was previously. For me, since it was a full screen source, I can just right click, go to transform, go to fit to screen, and it will go back to how it was previously. You could also just Control Z if you wanted. Below the easing drop down, there is also the easing function. This is a little bit more difficult to explain, but essentially this means how the easing out and easing in works in terms of what kind of a slope they have. There's a lot of different options. It's probably easier to show rather than tell. So at the end of the tutorial, once we've set everything else up, we can go and look at how the different options look. Once you've filled in the transform box and you know that the movement works, you can also see that below here there is a curve. The curve determines how much of an angle there is in the movement, and literally will decide if the movement goes like this. I can show you again just to make it more clear. If you do it normally without any curve, the movement is just linear, it goes straight in. Whereas if I add a curve, if I toggle the slider all the way to the left and I do it again, you can see that instead it does that kind of movement where it curves in. After this, you have the visibility and order dropdown. These decide the visibility of the source as well as the position in the source box of that particular source that is being moved. So for example, if we click on hide during movement, then when I use the source itself, it will be invisible, and once it reaches the end of the movement, it will become visible again. There's a lot of different options to play around with here. This could be particularly handy if you have something like a hidden source and then you want it to reveal at the end of the movement, or maybe you have a source that you want it to be visible during the movement, but you want to hide it both before and afterwards. There are a lot of different options here. It's great to play around with them and see which ones you prefer. Then you have the order dropdown. The order dropdown will decide where in the source box the source is located after the movement. This can be very powerful again, depending on your requirements. There are a couple of different options. You have the no change option, which means it just won't change. It's kind of, yeah. Then you have start absolute, end absolute, start relative, and end relative. Start absolute and end absolute treat the order of all of the sources in the source box as a defined list. So it will look at the first one as the first item, it will look at the second one as the second item, and so on. Whereas if you do the relative options, it will look at the position of the sources in relation to the source that moves. So you can see in the source box that we have the three different sources. We have the web camera source, we have the main camera source, and we have the microphone. If I choose the end absolute option and I choose 0, after I activate the filter, you can see that the main camera source moves. It moves from the middle to the bottom. And this is because this right here is saying that once the movement filter ends, to move the source to 0, which is going to be the very start or the very bottom of the list. After this, you have your audio section. So if you want to mute certain sounds when this movement happens, you can select them here. You can also choose to fade the sounds if you want, so it's not just a sudden sound change. Then at the end, you have probably the next most important section. This will decide a couple of different things about the movement and about how it's triggered and about what happens after it's over. You can see here you have the start trigger. You can choose to have the filter activate after a certain type of media is played or after a certain type of source becomes visible or invisible. You can do the same with the stop trigger as well. You can also have other filters activate at the same time with the simultaneous move dropdown. You can see here we have the move source and we have the dramatic zoom. These are both examples of the filters. So you can have one activate at the same time once it sees that the other is activated if you wanted to. Finally, you have the next move and the next move on. The next move means what happens once the movement ends. You can do none, in which case nothing will happen. The scene will stay at the same point at the end part and won't change. You also have reverse, which is where the movement will happen and then it will go back to how it was before the movement happened. If we select reverse and we activate, it does that. And then you can also choose to activate another movement once the movement ends. So you could choose to have it once the movement is over, you could choose to activate another one of the movement filters if you wanted. And then finally you have next move on, which means when can this filter be used again? The first option is when the move itself ends, and the second option is when you use a particular hotkey, so it's up to you, it is down to what you prefer. Since I said earlier that we would check out how the different types of easing functions work, now that we have this set up, I can go and show you how they look. Let's scroll up here. We have cubic at the moment, and you can see when we activate it, it looks like that. If we do something like elastic and activate it again, it looks very elastically, almost like a rubber band. You also have bounce. You have things like exponential. You have things like circular. They're very subtle, but they can make a difference depending on what you want. I recommend you play around with them and see which ones you like the most. That's the first function of the Move Transition plugin. Now we can move on to the next two. The next function of the Move Transition plugin that we have is the one that is actually in the name, and that is the Move Transition. So you can use this to move between different scenes, and if you have sources that have the same name in each of the scenes, it will actually move them over instead of making them disappear and reappear. I can show you an example of this here. First things first is you want to go to the transition box in OBS. If you click on the transition dropdown, you should see the option to add move. If you click on this, you can name the transition whatever you want, and then you click OK. You will see the window here, and you can set the settings as you see fit. To start off, you have the matching options. These allow you to try and match the sources as closely as you can, even if they might have things like another similar name, if they have numbers, if they have something to do with what words are there. These are definitely for playing around with because you can get closer matching. Ideally, you would keep the sources with the same names between scenes, but I know that's not always possible. Next, you have the general window. This just allows you to decide at what point does the source in scene A move over to the source in scene B. This can again depend on what you want and what your personal preferences are. I like to keep this as is. And then here you have your options for your matched items, for your appearing items, and your disappearing items. These can all be treated differently depending on what you want. So for example, you can do things like easing in for the appearing items. You can do different animations for the matched items that are moving over to the second scene. And then you can do something completely different for the items that are disappearing because they are not in the second scene. These things, I don't think there is going to be a standard piece of advice that works for everyone. It depends on what kind of assets you want, what kind of animations you want. It definitely is worth a play around with. But you can see then at the end, once you are done, you can actually preview the move and you can see how it will look in the box. And then you can also just go into OBS yourself and you can go and move between the different ones. So for example, here we have our just chatting scene. If I move over into my gameplay, you can see that the camera, which is still coming from the first scene, that just moved down from the bottom, and then the gameplay came in from the left. Then, for example, if I wanted to move to a scene where I have the camera on the right, I can do this and it will move across. And this is a good example of what the actual transition will look like. We are moving scenes, there are new elements being added in, but you can see that it looks like we are not. It looks like they're just being moved around. For example, you might even have a situation where certain games have important information at certain points, and you could do something like duplicating the scene, maybe giving it a different name like mid, and then you can move the camera up to the middle of the screen, or you can use the transform button and go center vertically, and then that way when you switch between these you can move it out of the way, or you could even set a hotkey to move it out of the way at key points depending on your preferences. This can be really handy to use. It looks really nice and it looks really neat when you are moving yourself around or when you are moving other elements around, and it is definitely worth a play around with to see how it suits you. The last function of the plugin is one that I see used less, You might see instances of the move transition in other streamers' content. However, this one I rarely see, and I think it can be really useful depending on what you want to use it for. It's called the audio move filter, and it only applies on audio sources. We're going to use it on the microphone. I'm going to right click on the microphone. I'm going to click filters, and then from there, I'm going to right click, go to add, and then go to audio move. From there, you can give it a name depending on what you want, or if you want to be able to remember it easily, and then you click OK, and you'll have a number of different options here. The first dropdown is used to measure when this filter should be activated. You have a couple of different options. You have your magnitude, you have your peaks, and then you have your input peaks. These are good to play around with, see which ones you prefer the most. You might have different results based on which option you use, but regardless of which you select, each of them is basically just measuring the input of the microphone to decide when to activate the filter. The next option you have is the easing. So that is going to be the point at which it decides to activate the filter. Again, this is very good to toggle around with. This might change based on other filters you have. For example, if you have a compressor filter like me, you might not hit the same normal peaks that you would with your microphone, and you might have to do a bit of testing and adjusting to make sure that you hit a range that you are comfortable with. After that, you have your action option. And this is where the filter comes into play. This is where you can start to see a lot of options and a lot of opportunities of things that you can do with it. If you click the drop down, you have a couple of different things you can toggle. For example, transform, so you might use it to move or transform a certain source. The next option is the setting, so you can use this to toggle a particular filter or a particular setting on something that you already have set. For example, if we go to the main camera, you can see that we have the shader filter selected here, and then actually I can have it change certain things like the radius or the tension or anything based on the sound input that is coming in. You also have the source visibility option, which means that once it reaches a certain point, it will show or hide a source. And then the last one you have is filter enable, so you can have it set so that when it reaches a certain point, it might enable or disable a filter. For this example, we're going to go with the filter enable option, but the others are good to play around with too, and you can find a lot of different customization options depending on what you want. So for this, if we go to the filter enable, you can see that it already has the main camera selected as the drop down, which is perfect. And then we have the shader filter here, which is selected. The threshold action is going to be where it decides what to do. So if you click the drop down again, you can see that you have the options like enable over or enable under. And it's important to note that if you select this, it means once it reaches a certain sound, it will turn on the filter and then it will not touch it again. The last two options will probably give you the most customization depending on what you want, but for this example, we're going to use these. You have the enable over and disable under setting. This means that at whatever point you decide is your threshold, as soon as the input signal goes over it, it will enable the filter, and as soon as it falls under, it will disable the filter. And then the last option you have is enable under and disable over, which is the reverse, where as long as it stays under a certain point, it will enable the filter, and then when it exceeds a certain point, it will disable the filter. For this example, we're going to use this one. We're going to enable over and disable under, and then you can toggle around here with the threshold. Once you have toggled the settings and you have it the way you want, you can then play with the threshold and have it decide at what point will it activate and at what point will the filter start to show. Let me toggle this so you can see how it'll look, and I'm going to set it so that once I start talking or whenever I am talking, the filter will activate, and as soon as I stop talking, the filter will deactivate. I'm going to set it to a very low threshold just so we can see this active. There you go. But if I set it to 0 and then I set it to 0.1, when I start talking, the filter will activate, and when I stop talking, the filter will deactivate. Just like that. Like I said, this one I see less often. However, I think this is a very powerful one. This can be used for a wide variety of things, and it is definitely worth a play around with. And there you go. These are the 3 functions of the Move Transition plugin. It is an incredibly powerful plugin. It can really up your production quality of your stream or your video, and it is definitely worth a look. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions or you have any comments, please leave them below. If you have any particular plugins for OBS that you enjoy yourself, please let me know just so I can see what other people enjoy. And if you liked what you saw, why don't you like and subscribe to see more of this in the future.